Hello, everyone, and welcome to this International Association of Genocide Scholars book launch webinar. I am Melanie O'Brien, the current president of IAGS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you again to what is the first book launch webinar of 2024 for a book by Dr. Nicole Fox. I'd like to introduce our panel participants today. Our discussant for today is Anna-Marie DeBeer, who grew up in Zimbabwe and currently teaches French and Francophone studies at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Her research interests include the relationship between collective trauma, memory, cultural heritage, and storytelling in Africa. She works on literary representations of the genocide in Rwanda and is the author of the monograph Sharing the Burden of Stories from the Tutsi Genocide, Rwanda, Écrire par devoir de mémoire, published by Palgrave in 2020. Her most recent book chapter, Remembering Rwanda Through Transitional Narrative, appeared in the edited text In the Shadow of Genocide, Memory, Justice, and Transformation Within Rwanda, which was co-edited by the IAGS first vice president, Stephanie Wolf, in fact, and published last year in 2023 by Routledge. Anna-Marie is currently finalizing a forthcoming monograph with colleagues on the role and evolution of genocide memorials in Rwanda, for which she has traveled to Rwanda on several occasions to visit genocide sites and memorials and interview survivors and officials. And having had the privilege of attending Anna-Marie and Stephanie's presentation at the IAGS conference last year on this work, I am really looking forward to that book when it comes out. Today, Anna-Marie is joining us from Pretoria in South Africa. Today's author is Nicole Fox, and Dr. Nicole Fox is an associate professor of criminal justice at California State University, Sacramento in the US. Her research centers on how racial and ethnic contention impacts communities, with a focus on how remembrances of adversity shape social change and collective memory. Her most recent project examines individuals who conducted acts of rescue during episodes of mass violence and theorizing the social factors that shape such high-risk actions. Her work has been supported by a number of very high-level grants from the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the National Science Foundation, Andrew Mellon Foundation, and many others. She also serves on the UN Economic and Social Council and contributes to the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which is held annually at the UN. Dr. Fox is joining us today from California in the United States. Now, Dr. Fox's book, After Genocide, Memory and Reconciliation in Rwanda, is published by University of Wisconsin Press, and this is the subject of our webinar today, as it is now out in paperback. The book focuses on how memorials to past atrocity impacts community development and reconciliation for survivors of genocide, and in particular, genocidal rape. I will now hand over to Anna-Marie and Nicole to discuss this excellent book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Nicole, I'd actually like to start off by thanking you so much for this privilege. First of all, of reading your very insightful book on memory and reconciliation that I've got with me here. And secondly, of the privilege of asking you some questions. I'm personally very interested in the role of memorials in post-genocide Rwanda, so I definitely appreciate your work. And I think I'm going to just jump right in and ask you my first question, which is, your book is the fruit of 9 years of field work, which is a lot, and multiple interviews with 72 survivors in post-genocide Rwanda. And I was wondering, just which parts of the interview process did you find particularly challenging and why?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to read my work so carefully and for developing such thoughtful questions to ask me. So I wanted to say that. And it's such an honor to have someone who knows Rwanda so well read my work and ask questions. So thank you again. Well, yes, it was the work of many years of going back and forth to Rwanda and of interviewing folks. So one of the things that was challenging that I talk about in my book is when I was asking folks about the process of reconciliation, uh, many of the survivors that I interviewed said that reconciliation was indeed happening. And they spoke about how reconciliation was this process of someone asking for forgiveness and then them pardoning them. However, when I was asking if it had happened to them, they said no. And so there was a disconnect of them asserting it was indeed happening in Rwanda, but it wasn't happening to them. And so what I was realizing is that something was going on with the ways that I was asking questions. And so my question wasn't capturing their experience. And so I needed to ask a better question. And so I went back to my interview guide and realized I needed to brainstorm and either ask more specific questions or ask more questions. And so I developed a series of different questions that as to what does reconciliation look like? What's it feel like? Are there examples in your everyday life that reconciliation or coexistence um, looks like on the ground? If someone were to come in who knows nothing about Rwandan society, what would this situation appear to them like? And so these series of different connections yielded much different responses. And so for me, what this taught me is that it's really important for a researcher to have these spaces in their research design to be able to reevaluate the questions that you ask, especially as an outsider, because we're not going to get this right. And the participants are going to be experts in their own experience, and we need to be able to access that experience. And our questions the first time aren't going to be able to, especially as academics.
Thank you very much. I think actually this ties in to some of my other questions. Let's maybe talk a little bit about positionality, culture, language, which, by the way, your discussion in the appendix on the complexity and you used the word messiness of fieldwork it was one of my favorite sections. Very useful for anybody who does field work in challenging type of situations, and especially your remarks on listening to silences and so on. So my comment here is for a non-native interviewer in terms of position. It's sometimes difficult to notice and interpret unspoken cues or silences in interviews, and these are often, I think, related to cultural ways of dealing with trauma and grief, or maybe cultural taboos, or in the context of Rwanda, maybe Rwandan ways of expressing emotions, maybe related to language barriers. So my question is, perhaps you can share us, some examples with us where you experienced cultural or language barriers that played a role in your interviews, or that became maybe obstacles or interesting situations for you.
Absolutely. So just from the first time I was making interviews and schedules, so I was scheduling interviews 2 to 3 weeks out with interview participants, and no one was showing up. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I was living with a Rwandan family. And so one of my dear friends, who I consider a sister, she was like, "Sister, this is foolish. You shouldn't be making these appointments 3 weeks out. Make them a couple days out. No one is going to remember your interviews 3 weeks out. 2 days out, that's what you need to do." And she said, Rwandans privilege the social. And so you're thinking about time all of the time. You're on white people's time, and you're not thinking about how Rwandans value time. And so as soon as I started saying, "Oh, can you have an interview in 2 days, or tomorrow, or later today, or this evening after dinner?" or at a coffee shop or tomorrow morning before work, I started being able to talk with people. Or some in the rural areas, I could say, could you have it, one later today or so. I started being able to have interviews and talk with people. And so this idea that I had and carried with me, this American sense of time, was not working. So that was one example. I also lived with a Rwandan family and had a translator that really helped with cultural cues. So I could say, is this normal? And he would say, yes, this is very normal. Or one time we were on a bus and we got taken off the bus and they searched our passports and everything. And I would say, is this normal? And he was like, this is not normal. So I could say, I could kind of ask what is normal in this situation and ask about it. But it was important for me to always remember that as many Kinyarwanda lessons that I took, the language lessons, as much as I could explain my project in the local language, as much as I ate the food and lived with the family and drove around the city and got to know, I was always American. And to remember that positionality and that privilege I had and how that operated in different ways and in different situations. And I think that was really confusing at different times because one example is that we don't we we're always thought like, do not be the white savior, let people have their own agency. And there was a position that I was put into where participants asked me to write a letter to the authorities to ask them to have better toilets. So I typed up the letter and printed it. And at the time, it was really hard to get printers and such. So I went to a bank and printed it and brought it in. And I said, here, you can sign all this. And they were like, we don't want to sign it. We want you to sign it and deliver it. But coming from my own white feminism, I thought, I shouldn't be the white savior in this. But what they wanted me to deliver this letter. And so I had to get off my high horse and just listen to what they actually wanted, which was for me to deliver the letter so that the authorities realized that white people were paying attention to their toilets and that's how they were going to get fixed. And there wasn't any manual to how you were supposed to act in this situation. And so what I was trying to do in my appendix was to say, let's open up some feminist conversations about what this field work looks like because it's really messy, and talk about how there's layer after layer of positionality of what's going on when we're doing this research and trying to understand what's going on in these post-atrocity conflicts, because there's poverty going on, there's trauma, there's gender rights, there's property rights, there's all of these things that are going on. And there's my identity and my privilege that I'm also trying to negotiate in the most ethical way that I know how. And it won't ever be right because the global politics aren't ethical.
That's actually so interesting in both of the answers or the discussions you've just given me to the answers. It's the flexibility that comes through, the importance of actually being flexible. If your field questions aren't working, then think about how to change them. Or if the approach that you thought you needed to have in your position is not working, then listen to what people say and adapt. So I think that's very valuable. I would also like to ask you maybe a little bit more about your choice of memorial sites. So for me, that was interesting because in our work, we're working on a variety of memorial sites, but we only do interviews once with a person because there's so many people to see. And I was interested with your choice to to focus on 3 memorial sites, and then because of that, you were able to conduct multiple interviews with the same participants rather than single interviews. So I have 2 questions for you there, but I think let's just do the first one and then we can move to the second one afterwards. And the one is what are the benefits? What did you find were the benefits of interviewing the same participants more than once in this context of understanding reconciliation and memory?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really interesting question. So one thing is I really wanted to immerse myself into everyday memory. So I wanted to know, how does memory function on this everyday level? And so I wanted to spend time with people, and I wanted to understand, do you go to the memorial on an everyday basis or on a weekly basis or a monthly basis? And so that meant spending a lot of time with people, not just interviewing them, but do you go to the garden? Do you work at the memorial? So hanging out around the memorials for months at a time, and then interviewing them multiple times in the year. And by doing so, I got a lot more information because people knew I was coming back and I was invested in the work. And so I I gained a lot of trust. And even after the third interview, I came back 2 years later, and then 3 years later, and then 5 years later. So I really got to know participants' life. I also got to see change over time. So I got to see how their lives changed over the course of 18 months. And then finally, I got to see how people's emotions change temporally with the institutional memory. And what I mean by that is, because Rwanda has these mourning periods that are institutionalized, where there's a government mourning period in the first, starting on April 6th, to the first week where things shut down. And when I was there, it was the full month. And I could really see how that month impacted people's feelings about reconciliation and memory, with the same questions that I asked them in the fall, and to see if that changed the way that they felt about reconciliation and memory. And it indeed did. And so that gave me insight about if NGOs or even government organizations or international organizations were to launch different programs, the mourning months would not be the time to do so, because of the way that people felt about memory and reconciliation, that actually people had a lot of anger and resentment. So those were some of the reasons that I felt like I getting to know people that well was really helpful.
Mm.
And having that space in between to also get to know their lives.
Okay, thank you very much.
But it was hard keeping track of people.
I can imagine, and people move around and their lives move on, and things change. Um, so combined maybe with that is also the choice. I did mention it a little bit earlier, but the choice of 3 specific memorials, and out of the hundreds of memorials in Rwanda, what was your rationale for choosing those 3 specific memorials to discuss? Was there, maybe you can talk a little bit about which 3 you chose. Was there a personal experience or conversation that influenced your choice? How did you arrive at those 3 specific memorials?
Yeah, so I wanted to look at how a national memorialization interacted with local lives. And so I wanted to pick 3 national memorials. And so I went and visited all of the national memorials. And I picked 3 that were within the same general area of each other, but I wanted to leverage a couple variables. So at the time, I picked 3 that had different levels of urbanicity. So one that was very urban, one that was pretty rural, and one that was kind of in between, that was in the suburbs, to see how those dimensions might change. And then I picked three that also had different orientations. So one that was very, very kind of oriented towards education. And the narrative of that memorial was really all about education. This memorial is dedicated to educating the public, educating the future generation. One that was all about the past, leaving the memorial exactly the way it was. And one that was all about kind of reconciliation, looking for a bright future. And I mainly wanted to know if the the way that a memorial was oriented changed the story that it was told, and how those stories um, influenced who was left out and who was included, and why that was. So, if the inclusion of evidence mattered, and what physical dimensions shaped that. Because what's interesting about those three memorials is some talked about gender-based violence and some didn't. And that wasn't because gender-based violence happened and didn't happen. You know, it happened all throughout the genocide, but certain aspects of a memorial lended to that story being more or less talked about. And I wanted to kind of figure out how that happened. And so having these different variables lended to having a greater understanding of what aspects of memorialization helps break that silence, what aspects of memorialization um, creates a dialectical relationship with a guide that allows certain things to happen in these memorial spaces.
Mm.
So I could kind of like isolate these different variables and better understand them in ways that might be helpful for understanding memorials in other post-atrocity places.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, I think that some of the things that you mentioned, the gender-based violence and um, the silencing some of the, or not all the stories being told, maybe that uh, really leads us a little bit also to discuss a notion that you speak about in your book, which you call the stratification of collective memory. So what is it? Maybe you can explain that to us, how, and specifically in the Rwandan context. How does it function in the Rwandan context?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think this also happens in other contexts. So I want to say that. So what I term in my book, the stratification of collective memory, I'll break it down. So for those folks who maybe hear that aren't from a sociology background, this idea of stratification is that there's this social order where some folks have more resources and some folks have less, and so there becomes this divide of resources or wealth or opportunities. And then collective memory is this idea that um, that the past is socially constructed, and that it's created by the the interests of the present day stakeholders. And so that past is narrated, and it structures how we react to present day conflicts and how we even create policy, and it even supports particular educational reforms or curriculum. And so it's quite important. However, what happens oftentimes is that those who are in power create the collective memory of the nation. And this happens in America, this happens all over the world, because the collective memory of the nation, usually you want it to be something that's nationalistic, something that's builds the nation up. In Rwanda, it's slightly more complicated in that when I was there was such significant trauma that the people who were sharing their stories at commemoration were oftentimes the narratives that brought less trauma. So they were the people who were flourishing in genocide's aftermath, rather than women who had been raped, or people who were in extreme poverty, or orphans who were still suffering with significant mental health crises. Because if those people shared, there would be a trauma effect that would be contagious throughout the crowds. And I even witnessed one of those, and they were awful. And there weren't enough mental health counselors to help the crowd. But what that did is it started to marginalize those who had stories that were really traumatic. And so those voices weren't represented in the commemorations, which commemorations were sometimes places where 5,000 people were, or where diplomats were, or where quite literally the collective memory was created. And so this was where, like, the testimonies and materials that were shared became the recorded history of Rwandan memorial practices. And in many ways, the recorded history of what happened during those violent months in 1994. And so, in that way, the collective memory became really stratified in Rwanda. And I think this can happen in other places as well.
Thank you very much. That is, I think that also then is linked to your specific chapter on gendered violence and the politics of remembering and forgetting, which I found particularly interesting. So, what sparked your personal interest in gendered genocide violence?
Well, I think what sparked my interest is the ubiquity of it. So I learned, I think as an undergraduate, that there just hadn't been a war or genocide without gender-based violence, like in recorded history. And it puzzled me that it hadn't become a war crime for so long, and it hadn't become a crime of genocide for so long. And it seemed like acceptable behavior in these contexts. And then I heard something about how, wars are fought on the bodies of women. And that made a lot of sense to me, because the reason that rape is used is because it's so effective in destroying communities. And so that really spoke to how important it was to acknowledge this type of violence.
So did you, it seemed that you interviewed obviously men and women, but did you feel then, especially with your specific interest in this, did you feel that interviewing women I'm talking in Rwandan context specifically, that it was different from interviewing men about their genocide experiences? Maybe the way they told their story or anything like that?
I mean, I did in some ways, because some of them had never been asked about their experiences, but I didn't ask. I want to be clear that I didn't ask anyone about their stories of survival, because that wasn't my research question. I was told about their stories of survival often in the second and third interview, but my research question was about, like, memorials and memory and reconciliation, because I didn't want to do any more harm than what was done. I didn't want anyone to have to live through what they had already lived through if they didn't want to share their story. But many people did want to share their story and did want to share what they had gone through, because they were really dedicated to wanting to the world to know what they had survived. And this was true for many of the women. And many of the women had their story told or hadn't gotten a cow. So some of the men had gotten cows from the government for their story of survival, and many of the women hadn't. And the women were by far the poorest of those that I had interviewed. And this is true for a project that I'm doing with my colleague Holly as well at Ohio State. We're interviewing rescuers, and we're interviewing women rescuers as well. And we have the largest sample of women rescuers in Rwanda. And none of the women rescuers have won any award from the government. And none of the women rescuers have any hope that they ever will. But the men have gotten awards from the government. And any of the men who haven't gotten an award for the rescue still have hope that they will. So there's a gender difference in terms of whose story feels like they'd be had. And I don't want to blame the Rwandan government for this, because I don't think this is a problem of the Rwandan government. I think this is a problem of patriarchy throughout the world, because we see this in Bosnia's memorials, and this is true. I mean, in 1994, in the Holocaust Museum, Andrea Dworkin famously wrote that she was looking for women, and there was no exhibit or acknowledgement that the Nazis purposely, did crimes against women and sexually assaulted women, and there was nothing. And that was in 1994. So this isn't particular to Rwanda, but it is problematic. And it's problematic because when we don't acknowledge gender-based violence and conflict, it leads to this constant notion of a quote unquote discovery of rape. And that like scholars are discovering that rape occurred, and there's no discovery. This is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is happening in Sudan. This is happening in every conflict that is going on at this moment. And so until we stop discovering rape and acknowledge that this is happening as a product of conflict and criminalize it as such, we're not going to value women's experiences and men's. This is also happening to men and boys.
So given the prevalence of gender-based violence and sexual violence, and then the obviously many women's stories that do exist, I got the sense from your book that although it was different from the three memorials, and you didn't necessarily experience the same thing, but in general, the women's stories, not only the women, there were other marginalized groups as well, but we're talking about women right now, so that the women's stories were silenced or invisibilized or not really brought to the fore at these memorials and in post-genocide Rwanda in general. So do you have a theory about the reasons for that?
I don't think they were across the board silenced. I think that there were some instances in which they were silenced, and there were some rules in which they were silenced. So I think women's aftermath and poverty was silenced. And I think the reason of that is because it's not an uplifting narrative. And I think that as Rwanda's rebuilding, they're really focusing on uplifting narratives to, and there are many of those, to rebuild the nation. And I think at some memorials, they're focusing on reconciliation and education. And it's really difficult to talk about sexual violence when you're talking about reconciliation, because it's almost easier to think about reconciling with a perpetrator of genocide than a perpetrator of rape.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we have to work our way around thinking about why that is, and process that. And if that indeed is true, then we really need to think about then what the crime of rape does to our society, and then why we aren't acknowledging it. So I think, and then I think we need to focus on these amazing memorials that do break the silence, because those are the places that are actually doing incredible work, because so many spaces have not been able to talk about gender-based violence 30 years after, 20 years after, because that's remarkable, right? We haven't seen Cambodia be able to do that, or Bosnia, or the Holocaust within 20 years. So those are the spaces that we need to say, what's happening here? And it seems like evidence is something that's helpful, because it takes the burden off the guide and say, how do we open up these spaces? Because what I'm seeing is that we can't allocate funding, we can't empathize, we can't give understanding or recognition to a group of survivors that have experienced sexual violence if we don't know that they exist. So until that we acknowledge that this has happened, and there is an acknowledgement, but they really need to have that. Survivors are still going. Me and my colleague Judith just wrote a policy brief on this, into how we demystify their experiences, and they don't have to travel multiple towns away to remain anonymous to get counseling. You know, they're, that's, that has to happen. That isn't very eloquent, but there needs to be some work, and that's not just in Rwanda. Obviously, we're still dealing with that in America.
So did you did you come across any forms of resistance in the society against this type of stratification of violence, or of memories, or ranking of memories, and let's call it then the invisibilization of certain stories? If you did, who were they, and how did they resist this?
Yeah, I mean, that one memorial I spoke of, I mean, consistently told these stories of like all of the women. And I think there are other memorials that tell these stories that are really, really difficult to tell, but force people to listen to these challenging narratives about what happened. There also were a lot of groups of women and men that really challenged commemoration staff to say, we really want these stronger images shown. We really want these stronger testimonies shown, even if they cause trauma, because we really believe that it's important to show this, because we don't want people to forget what happened. And so there were a lot of survivors that pushed back. I think your work is particularly important too, because a lot of survivors turn to these local commemorations, these local spaces, to try to also have memory live on in those spaces as well. I think a lot of survivors also turn to getting getting mental health and help, and that felt like a form of resistance in their own way. So like one survivor I spoke with, I came back and visited her 5 years later, and she had suffered so much trauma that her child had been taken away when I had last seen her, with a group of nuns. And then when I came back and visited her, her daughter was back, and she was really proud, and she had gotten her child back. And so she really saw that as like this form of resistance, because she had gotten better, she had done all this hard work, and now she was strong enough that she could tell her story without experiencing the trauma. So I think resistance happens on all these smaller ways, but I think it can be really difficult.
Mm. Yes, I think also you basically said, until we don't acknowledge what people have gone through, and acknowledge the existence of certain stories. Now I'm wondering, in maybe in two types of spaces, in memorials themselves, how do you think, what was your experience, and also maybe how do you think one could create more space for marginalized stories? So in the memorials themselves, and maybe then us as an international society, how can we acknowledge those or create space for those stories?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think like I think in international spaces, opening up places to talk about how important and prevalent this is. I think opening up spaces for women's voices. And I don't know if women survivors are wanting testimony. So I don't think that's necessarily the venue to go for. And that's one thing that I really learned, is that women don't necessarily want testimony themselves. They don't want to give testimony, but they want someone to acknowledge that people like a story like theirs to be present.
Mm.
And so I think making sure that stories like theirs are represented in
Mm.
spaces. And so I think that making sure that those stories are told when we're talking about genocide and when we're talking about mass atrocity is really important. And
Mm.
so making sure that whenever we're talking about mass atrocity, we're also making sure that we're talking about gender.
Mm.
And whenever we're talking about mass atrocity policy and when we're talking about genocide policy, we're making sure we're always talking about gender. So
Mm.
that's one thing I think is really important to say, is to make sure that they're not forgotten. And and whenever we're thinking about memory and memorialization, especially as a form of transitional justice, and advocating as memorial as a form of transitional justice, is to make sure that those are inclusive. And that means thinking about race, thinking about poverty, thinking about ethnicity, thinking about geographic location, and thinking about gender. And so thinking about the policy briefs that we write about memory and transitional justice and the advocacy work that we do. And so, if you're on the ground and you're doing this work and you have the opportunity to give back to, or you have access to government, to the government to give them advice, thinking about giving advice about that. It's hard to sometimes have access to governments that will listen to you about memorialization, but if you do have a listening ear, I think that's part of it.
Mm.
Um, I'll keep thinking too, but I think making sure, I mean, what I try to do is I asked all of my interviewees, like I teach, at least, over 150 students every year. What do you want me to make sure they hear? And so I have a list of all the things they want me to make sure I tell my students every year. And that's what I try to tell my students every year and promise to tell them about Rwanda and about what they survived.
Okay, so maybe to change tack a little bit here, we've spoken quite a bit about memory, but your work focuses on memory and reconciliation. So in the aftermath of communal violence, and maybe I could also mention I enjoyed your distinction between institutional, that almost utopian reconciliation formula,
Mm-hmm.
and then on the other hand, the everyday lived experience of reconciliation amongst survivors. So after talking to survivors about reconciliation and the aftermath, what would you say are the top priorities for post-conflict zones, in the eyes of the survivors, not just Rwanda, but maybe in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's two of them. So I think one of them is that survivors have to have their basic needs met. So that includes like food, getting out of getting out of poverty. So food, clean water, shelter, functioning bathroom facilities and toilets. Because a lot of participants in my that I interviewed talked about how it was it's hard to bring survivors to the table when you're talking about reconciliation if they don't have enough food to eat, if they're worried about their basic needs. And especially when they're struggling in poverty because the breadwinner of their house was murdered, because their children were murdered. And so they're in a position of poverty because of genocide or mass atrocity. The second one is thinking really seriously about forensic technology to identify bodies or figuring out truth commissions and other reconciliation or trials or local courts so that those who are victims of crimes or have lost family members know how their family members died or where their loved ones are buried. Because those who seem to have the hardest time moving on are those who didn't know what happened to their loved ones. And this was true in my study, but we know this from Argentina, from Mexico, from the former Yugoslavia, from all over the Balkans, from other studies as well, that it's incredibly difficult for people if they don't know what's happened to their loved ones. And so that forensic technology or those transitional justice mechanisms can be really helpful in that process.
I think I'm going to maybe wind this down with a little bit more of a personal question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You mentioned in that appendix in the end, you did speak a little bit about secondary trauma, because participating in this type of field work is of course, can be very intense, very emotional.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I thought maybe you could just describe or talk about some of the powerful moments you had. Is any observations, visits, something that had a strong impact on you, that stays with you even today, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. And for those who are listening, and especially those who are listening that maybe have students who are embarking in this, I would definitely encourage them to think about the trauma that their students may experience, because I didn't think about that while embarking on this journey at all. I thought that maybe I would hear some horrible stories but then would be fine, and I did hear some really horrific stories, and some of them I heard from mothers, and your brain is kind of amazing what it does. And so I heard some really awful stories about mothers who, had their children killed, and they were really, really disturbing, but my brain literally filed them away. And it wasn't until I had children that they came back to me. And so when I had my son, it was literally like a flood of these stories. And I think they really contributed to like postpartum anxiety when I had my son. And so I started remembering just story after story that mothers had for me. And that was, 3 years after doing these interviews. So that was one way that it impacted me. And then when I was doing field work, I was having, some nightmares. And then at one point, I talk about in my book that I was doing interviews and going to these commemorations, like I spoke of, and there were times when people were having traumatic responses and screaming and having to go to, out to ambulances and being taken away, and I was taking some children to the pool that I lived with, and I kept hearing people screaming, but no one was there, and it was just some second. I swore I was hearing it, but no one was there. It was just me at the pool with all the kids laughing. And so luckily I had a friend who was a priest and had done a degree in counseling and said, you're experiencing secondary trauma, you need a break. But it happened a lot. And, I felt really guilty because like I hadn't experienced any of this. I was just listening. So it can definitely happen. And I just recently had a meeting with a lot of people who do this type of work. And a lot of us shared about all of the secondary trauma that we experience. And so I think it's important to really talk about and that remind us that it doesn't make us weak. We're not robots. It's important to have empathy. It's important for our participants to know that we care about them. You don't want to steal the show with your own tears or anything, but you do want to make sure that you take care of yourself so that you can also be an empathetic listener. And you also want to make sure you can pause and make sure that they want to continue too. You want to do no harm where harm has already been done. Do no more harm where so much harm has already been done.
Thanks for sharing that. I think I want to now have my final questions to you is really just an open invitation. If you have any final thoughts you want to share with the viewers, and maybe just tell them how they can get hold of your book, or if you have any news on the book and so on. So
Yes. Well, if you buy it on the website, I have a discount code. It's AA246 for this webinar. So you can get a percentage off. So if you would like. And thank you so much. Just that this is important work and it's challenging, but we can't turn away because it's so important. But thank you so much for your thoughtful questions, for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna Marie and Nicole. That was really, really interesting. And even though I haven't done research in Rwanda, that's not my area, I could certainly see, well, first of all, I learned many things, but also a lot of concepts that I see parallel in my own research. So, thank you so much for such an enriching, and really personal discussion as well. Nicole, I'm just going to use my chair prerogative here to ask a question I like to ask authors, is that, could you tell us about the photo on the cover of your book?
Oh yeah. That is a photo of a mass grave early on. And I thought it was a powerful photo. And it was also less disturbing than some of the other photos. although my friends who are not in the field, whenever they see my book, are like, oh, and so yeah, so I thought it captured kind of what the early days were like.
Right. So in wrapping this up, I will also do a little bit of promotion thanks to a couple of things that Nicole mentioned. So the policy brief that Nicole mentioned is an IAGS policy brief that she co-authored with Judith Rafferty on sexual violence and genocide, and it is available on the policy briefs page of the IAGS website, which Elisenda will pop into the chat for everyone. I also just want to let everyone know that the recording of this webinar will be made available on the IAGS YouTube channel, where you can also watch past book launch and other webinars. The next IAGS related webinar that is coming up is actually this Friday, the 26th of April, in partnership with the American Bar Association's International Criminal Law Committee and the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. And it will be launching a report that has been written by the Raoul Wallenberg Center, Breaches of the Genocide Convention in Darfur, Sudan. And this is an extensively researched and well-documented report on the ongoing atrocities in Darfur, Sudan. The information for that was sent out to the IAGS listserv, and the registration link will also be popped in the chat here. So that's this Friday, April the 26th at 11 a.m. US Eastern Time. Also, keep an eye out for our upcoming more book launch webinars as the year goes on. They'll be announced on the listserv and on the website. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. But for today, would very much like to thank Anna Marie and Nicole for this wonderful discussion about Nicole's book, which I'm sure everyone will now go out and grab the paperback version, which is, of course, the affordable version for everyone out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.